The blue lights hit your rearview mirror before you even realize what you did. Your stomach drops a little. You ease off the gas, glance at your speed, check your mirrors again, and that quiet thought creeps in. Was I speeding, or is this something else? You pull over, engine idling. Hands suddenly feel heavier than they should. You're aware of everything now. The passing cars, the ticking sound from your dashboard, the slow approach of the officer behind you. And then that moment every driver knows. The officer steps out of their vehicle. Let me ask you something, and be honest with yourself. What's going through your mind the moment an officer walks up to your window during a traffic stop? Have you ever said something you later regretted, or stayed silent and wondered if that made things worse? Drop your answer in the comments, because what most people think they should do in that moment is often exactly what creates problems later. And there's something important about that dynamic that I'll break down as we go. Now here's where things get interesting. Most traffic stops are routine. That's what we're told, and for the most part, it's true. But routine doesn't mean simple. It doesn't mean harmless. And it definitely doesn't mean predictable. What looks like a basic stop can shift in tone and direction within seconds, depending on something as small as how you answer a question, or whether you answer at all. I want you to picture this scenario clearly. An officer walks up to the driver's side window. Calm face, neutral tone. Good evening. Do you know why I stopped you? That question right there is one of the most misunderstood moments in any traffic stop. People panic internally. Some immediately start guessing. Was I speeding? Did I miss a sign? My taillight, maybe? Others go the opposite direction and shut down completely. But here's what most drivers don't realize. That question isn't just small talk. It's not even really about the reason for the stop. It's about observation. The officer is watching how you respond. Are you nervous? Defensive? Overly talkative? Avoiding eye contact? Too eager to explain? And this is where a lot of people make their first mistake. They start talking. A lot. I'm sorry, I didn't realize I was going that fast. I was just trying to get home. I've had a long day. Traffic was weird back there. Now think about that. You haven't even been told why you were stopped yet, and you've already started offering explanations, maybe even admissions. You're trying to be cooperative, maybe even respectful. But from the officer's perspective, you're giving them information they didn't ask for. That matters, because once words are out, they can't be taken back. And during a stop, every word has potential weight. Now let's shift slightly. Imagine a different driver. Same stop, same question. Do you know why I stopped you? And the driver responds calmly, No, officer. Simple, direct, no extra information. You'd be surprised how different that interaction can feel from the officer's side. Not necessarily suspicious, but controlled, measured. And that's where tone starts to matter more than words. Because officers aren't just listening to what you say, they're evaluating how you say it. Your pacing, your voice, your hesitation, even your silence. Now here's where things can start escalating without people realizing it. The officer asks for license, registration, and proof of insurance. Standard request. You reach for your documents. Maybe your hands shake a little. That's normal. But let's say you start digging through your glove box, papers falling out, taking longer than expected. You start apologizing again. Maybe you explain why everything's messy. From your perspective, it's harmless. From the officer's perspective, it's uncertainty, movement, delay, and that's where suspicion can start creeping in. Not necessarily because you've done something wrong, but because your behavior doesn't feel predictable. Now here's something a lot of drivers don't think about. Officers are trained to expect certain patterns. When those patterns break, even for innocent reasons, it creates tension. That's why even small things can change the direction of a stop. Let's talk about another common moment. The officer takes your documents and walks back to their patrol car. Now you're sitting there, waiting. Minutes pass. It feels longer than it is. And here's where drivers start overthinking. Why are they taking so long? Are they running something? Is this about more than a traffic violation? Sometimes it is. Sometimes it isn't. But here's the key point. Time during a stop is not neutral. The longer it goes, the more opportunities there are for something to shift. Now imagine this situation. The officer returns. But instead of immediately handing back your documents, they start asking more questions. Where are you coming from tonight? Where are you headed? Is this your vehicle? At this point, a lot of drivers feel pressure to answer everything quickly, politely, completely. And this is where another major mistake happens. They treat every question as mandatory. But not every question during a traffic stop is legally required to be answered. And more importantly, not every question is asked for the same reason. Some questions are about the stop itself. Others are about building context. And sometimes, they're about seeing if your answers stay consistent. Now here's where tension builds. Let's say the driver hesitates. Maybe they give a short answer. Maybe they choose not to elaborate. The officer's tone changes slightly. Just trying to understand what you're doing out here. Now the pressure increases. It's subtle, but it's there. And this is where people often talk themselves into trouble, not because they're guilty of anything serious, but because they feel like silence looks suspicious. That belief alone causes more problems than people realize. Silence, when done calmly and respectfully, is not inherently suspicious. But nervous silence, defensive silence, that's different. And officers can tell the difference. Now let's introduce the moment where things can go very wrong. The officer asks the driver to step out of the vehicle. This is where most people feel a spike in anxiety. Heart rate goes up, thoughts start racing. Am I being detained? Did I do something serious? Is this about to escalate? And here's the truth that surprises a lot of people. In many situations, officers are legally allowed to ask you to step out of the vehicle during a traffic stop, even if the original reason was minor. That doesn't automatically mean you're in trouble, but it does mean the dynamic has shifted. Now imagine this driver steps out. They're nervous. They start talking again. I didn't do anything wrong, I swear, I was just driving, I don't know why this is happening. From the officer's perspective, that kind of response can actually raise more questions. Why the urgency? Why the defensiveness? And this is where tone becomes more important than content. Because even if you're completely innocent, how you present yourself affects how the situation unfolds. Now here's where the title of this conversation starts to make sense. There are situations where an officer is on the verge of making a serious mistake, not necessarily out of bad intent, but out of assumption, pressure, or misinterpretation. And sometimes it takes a supervisor stepping in to prevent that. Let's walk through a realistic scenario. An officer conducts a stop for a minor traffic violation. The driver is cooperative but slightly nervous. Answers are short. Movements are cautious. The officer starts to suspect something more. Maybe they think the driver is hiding something. Maybe the behavior doesn't match their expectations. They begin asking more probing questions. The driver becomes more uncomfortable. Now the officer considers escalating, maybe requesting a search, maybe detaining the driver longer than necessary. This is where things can cross a line if not handled carefully. But then a supervisor arrives. They assess the situation differently. They look at the totality of what's actually happening, not just the officer's interpretation. They might notice that the driver's nervousness is normal, that the answers, while brief, are consistent, that there's no clear evidence justifying further escalation. And in that moment, the supervisor can step in and say, in effect, "This isn't going where you think it is." That intervention can prevent a situation from turning into something much bigger. And here's the part most people don't see. Mistakes during traffic stops don't always come from aggression. They often come from assumption layered on top of incomplete information. That's why your behavior as a driver matters so much. Not because you need to perform for the officer, but because every action contributes to how the situation is interpreted. Now let's talk about something a lot of people misunderstand. Being polite does not mean being overly talkative. Being respectful does not mean agreeing with everything. And being silent does not mean being uncooperative, if it's done correctly. The balance is where most people struggle, because in that moment, with lights flashing and adrenaline high, it's hard to think clearly. That's why people default to habits. Some people talk too much. Some people shut down completely. Some people become defensive without realizing it. And all of those reactions can influence the outcome. Let's go deeper into one more situation. The officer asks, "Do you mind if I take a look inside your vehicle?" This question right here has caused more confusion and more unintended consequences than almost any other part of a traffic stop. Because it sounds casual. Do you mind? That phrasing makes it feel optional, but also pressured. And this is where drivers often make a decision they don't fully understand in the moment. They say yes, not because they want to, but because they feel like saying no will make things worse. But here's the reality. Consent changes everything. Once you give it, the scope of the interaction expands significantly. And if there was no legal basis for a search before, your consent just created one. Now imagine this scenario unfolding. The driver hesitates. The officer reads that hesitation as uncertainty, maybe even suspicion. Tension builds. But before it escalates further, a supervisor steps in. They evaluate whether there's actual justification for continuing down that path. And sometimes they pull things back. Not because the officer was acting maliciously, but because the situation was drifting beyond what was legally or reasonably supported. That's the massive mistake you don't see on the surface. It's not always dramatic, it's often subtle. A line that could have been crossed, but wasn't. Now here's what I want you to take away from all of this. Traffic stops are not just about laws. They're about perception, communication, and timing. Every second matters. Every word matters. Even silence matters. And the biggest mistakes drivers make are usually small ones that stack up over time. Talking too much. Moving too quickly. Assuming they have to answer everything. Letting nerves control their behavior. None of those things make you guilty, but they can make the situation more complicated than it needs to be. And sometimes, the difference between a routine stop and a serious problem comes down to how those moments unfold. So the next time you see those blue lights, remember, it's not just about what you did before the stop. It's about everything that happens after.